All right, guys. So what I'm going to do is I'm gonna make this video for you, run through today's today's stuff on the president's administration and the federal bureaucracy. Okay, so follow along with this, write some stuff down, pause, take your time as you go through. This is all for the most part stuff that you're gonna need to know though. Okay, so first we're going to start with just a couple things within the president's administration. This is the things that are the closest to the president. Obviously, the number one thing we have is the vice president, right? This is the vice executive. Okay, and the vice president constitutionally only has two jobs. Okay, so there's not much that they're required to do. They're required to take over for the president if something happens. And remember, they're given that job to be the president of the Senate. Okay, but ultimately, the president of the Senate, basically what that boils down to is if there is a tie, they would cast a tie-breaking vote. Okay, so it's often their job is going to be what the president wants them to do. And generally, that person is usually picked on this basis of what we call balancing the ticket. Okay, so that is trying to pick a running mate who is not exactly always similar to you, because in order to win an election, you're trying to get as many voters as possible. A good example that I could give you, maybe some of you remember this, but in 2008, John McCain, who was an older white male Republican running for president, his running mate, he chose Sarah Palin, who was a young female Republican up and coming. That was done to try to balance the ticket, right? Appeal to as many people as possible. Get some of those women who generally vote Democrat, try to attract them by having a female running mate. Of course, that kind of backfired on him eventually, but that's a good example of what balancing the ticket would be. Okay, but of course, it is an important office. Okay, a lot of vice presidents have become presidents because of whatever it might be, death, resignation, something like that. Okay, I'm going to come back and talk about the vice president being the tie-breaking vote when I use an example with the bureaucracy later. Okay, a couple other things. This is the executive office, so this is the people that work, basically on a day-to-day basis with the president. You have the White House office, which is the immediate staff to the president. This is things like the chief of staff, who organizes everything. Top advisor, the press secretary is the person who speaks on behalf of the president to the press and whatnot. A chief of staff is tremendously important to politicians, and everybody has a chief of staff. Okay, when we look at local office holders and whatnot, they even have a chief of staff. So that's the person who's just behind the scenes that really does a ton on behalf of, in this case, the president. The National Security Council, this is a group of the top military officials that focuses on national security. So this is going to include people like the Vice President, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which is the heads of each of the branches of military, and they're going to prepare a report that the president is going to see basically on a daily basis. Okay, so by the way, the guy that was supposed to come talk to us today, I'm recording this on Wednesday, the guy that was supposed to talk to us today was a former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff who went to Notre Dame, I think was in the 60s. So unfortunately, we obviously had to cancel that. That's too bad. That would have been cool to hear from him. Other groups on an economic front, you have the Council of Economic Advisors. They provide the president with expert analysis of the economy, help assist in formulating economic policy. That is a 3-member group who is confirmed by the Senate. Okay, the people we were just talking about, like the chief of staff and the press secretary and whatnot, those don't have to be confirmed by the Senate. So the president can kind of pick and fire whoever he wants. The Office of Management and Budget, very important group of multiple hundred employees that work on implementing the federal budget, on putting the federal budget proposal together. The leader of this does have to be confirmed by the Senate, okay? And these are the people that really put together the ins and outs of the budget based on the president's wishes. Okay, tremendously important. These two are obviously very important with what we're going through right now in this potential economic crisis we're getting into. Okay, most important thing I want you to take away from this is these next few slides, okay? So these are the executive departments. Okay, so we have 15 executive departments that are in charge of implementing the law, okay? The president gets to choose the head of these departments, okay? That's who we call the cabinet. So, for example, you have our first three. These were the first three departments created: the Department of State, Department of Treasury, and what used to be called the Department of War, we call it the Department of Defense. Whoever the president chooses for that job, they have to be confirmed by the Senate. Okay, so whoever, depending on who the president chooses, that's going to have a lot of impact on, which direction he wants to go with implementing the law under that area. Okay, so for example, Department of Defense. If the president chooses an old, military general who's known for being very aggressive, aggressive with military and so on, that's going to put our military in a much different direction than if you pick someone who's very much, more anti-war and so on. That's going to change dramatically how, those jobs are actually carried out. Okay, so this is all in order of when these were created. Okay, so these were the first three created in 1789. The rest of these are going to be created to kind of meet the new needs of the nation, okay, as we go on. So you have the Department of Justice. That's headed by the Attorney General. They're responsible for all law enforcement. You've heard a lot about our Attorney General, William Barr, in recent months. Okay, the Department of Interior, they manage and protect our public land. Department of Agriculture assists farmers, consumer of farm products, commerce with trade and business. Department of Labor, concerned with the working conditions and wages of the United States workers. Health and Human Services works for the health and well-being. So just as an example, I was saying that, these kind of get created as issues come up in our country. So think about this for a second. When do you think the Department of Labor may have been created? Okay, just take a second, think historical context. When would it make sense that we would have to create a Department of Labor to, that's working with working conditions and wages? Hopefully what popped into your head was the Industrial Revolution, right? When all of a sudden we have these new issues come about with, long working hours and low wages. If we're going to start implementing things like minimum wages and whatnot, we need people in the Department of Labor that can actually enforce those laws, right? That's the whole point of all of these executive departments. Okay, more recently, these are the ones that have, in recent history, have been created: housing and urban development, transportation, energy, education, veteran affairs, and of course the most recent executive department out of the 15 that has been created is the Department of Homeland Security. Okay, and you can probably imagine that was created, of course, right after 9/11. Okay, so that's the most recent of our cabinet departments here. Just going back to, the president choosing the head and the vice president having the ability to cast a tie-breaking vote, the Department of Education, that is one where you would expect that's not usually a controversial nominee, whoever's going to be the Secretary of Education. However, President Trump's appointee did get a lot of scrutiny by the Senate, who had to confirm. He chose a lady, maybe you've heard the name, Betsy DeVos. She's our Secretary of Education. And she actually came down, and when the Senate voted, it was a 50-50 tie. Okay, so Vice President Pence actually cast that tie-breaking vote to confirm her into that position. Just a little bit more about the bureaucracy. One of the things, the reason why this was a heavily scrutinized decision is because people saw this as being what we call patronage. Okay, basically not choosing someone on merit, choosing them on being loyal party members, and so on. Okay, and the reason being, and the reason I know this because the DeVos family's from Grand Rapids, Michigan, which is where I'm from, and they are longtime Republican Party supporters. Her husband ran for governor in Michigan a few years back, so they're kind of friends of President Trump and whatnot. So that was heavily scrutinized. You even had a couple Republicans vote against their party to vote against confirming her, but ultimately she was confirmed with the Vice President Pence. Okay. Now, this is where the bureaucracy really starts to expand. Okay, we have hundreds of federal agencies that are in specialized areas to enforce the law. Okay, so there's going to be 3 different types that I want you to know, and we're going to look into some of these more specifically. Okay, so our independent executive agencies, these manage a specialized area of the government. Okay, so this is things like NASA. You know what NASA's in charge of. The Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. The Federal Elections Commission, they oversee campaign finance laws, stuff like that. The Environmental Protection Agency. I think everybody's heard of the EPA. These, again, The heads of these departments are people that would have to be appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate. Okay, there are also independent regulatory commissions. Okay, they regulate a certain aspect of the economy. So this gives them a little bit more leeway with, they start to make and enforce rules. So it gives them a little bit of legislative authority. It kind of blurs the lines between the branches of government every once in a while. They usually have a board of members who are supposed to be nonpartisan, that are nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. Okay, so this would include things like the Federal Communications Commission. So let me give you an example of what the FCC would do, and think about it in your head for a second too. What might the Federal Communications Commission actually regulate? Okay, and a great example that I have is, and you guys, I don't even know I can't remember how long ago this was now. You guys might not even been alive at this point, but you might remember the very famous Super Bowl halftime show where Justin Timberlake, ripped off part of Janet Jackson's wardrobe, and there was a quote-unquote wardrobe malfunction, right? And basically there was slight nudity on TV for millions and millions of people to see, okay? So like the FCC is the group that steps in and fined CBS, whatever it was, $1 million for that mistake. Okay, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. This was something that was created with the Civil Rights Acts that started to be passed in the 50s and 60s. Right, so if we're going to start passing anti-discrimination laws, well, you need a body, of the executive branch that can actually go out and enforce and make sure that people are following those laws. Okay, so that's what regulatory commissions do. Lastly, we have government corporations. Okay, so these are run like a business, but they're owned by the federal government. Okay, so basically, they're run like a business, but they're not run for profit. They charge enough that they can keep themselves in business. Okay, so two best examples, the Postal Service and Amtrak, right? Postal Service, that's the closest thing we ever see to the federal government on a daily basis. Those are all federal workers. So that's the closest you'll come. Amtrak, you should know what Amtrak is, right? It's a passenger rail service that goes across America, right? That's where, when you need to find yourself and go see America, you just pack up a bag, buy a couple Amtrak tickets, and cruise the countryside. All right. Okay, I'm gonna stop there. But that's just kind of an overview that kind of runs through the federal bureaucracy and how expansive the executive branch actually is, and how wide-spanning they are. And again, remember the whole point of the bureaucracy is that if Congress is going to pass laws, you, of course, cannot expect the president and their close workers to be able to enforce that law across 50 different states, right? You need agencies of the federal government that are going to be out there to actually, enforce those laws that have been passed. All right, so hopefully this helps. Again, as you're going through, go back, rewind, write some stuff down, whatever you need to do. But you have this at your disposal to use to kind of fill in those notes and come along with us. Okay, so we'll do some review on this in the next class.